I'd never put much stock in ghost stories or the whole things that go bump in the night mythos. My job at the warehouse had its share of late nights, but the only haunting I'd encountered was the specter of overtime. My coworkers had spun tales about strange occurrences, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, a feeling of being watched, or even mysterious voices. But to me, these were just stories to pass the time during late shifts. Until that one night. I was huddled over my desk, working through a towering stack of paperwork. My only company was the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As I completed yet another form, the lights flickered. I looked up, mildly irritated. "Not now," I mumbled, hoping it was just a brief hiccup in the electrical system. But when the flickering persisted, I decided to check the circuit breaker. After a cursory look at the breaker box revealed nothing out of the ordinary, I shrugged and returned to my desk. And that's when I noticed it, a dark shadow lurking in the far corner of the room. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, perhaps a residual effect of staring at paperwork for too long. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The shadow remained, now seeming to take on a more definitive, human shape. My rational mind searched for a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the angle of the light, or perhaps some object casting an unusual shadow. I leaned over to switch on the desk lamp, but before I could, the shadow began to move. It inched closer, its form becoming increasingly distinct. My heart pounded in my chest like a drumbeat of dread. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow offered no response, it just kept creeping closer. It stretched its form across the desk, shrouding my paperwork in darkness. Then it reached for my hands, its touch icy and void-like. The terror I felt was paralyzing, but I snapped out of it long enough to remember the flashlight in the drawer. I fumbled for it and flicked it on, aiming it directly at the shadow. To my utter disbelief, the shadow dissipated. But what was even more shocking was that all the paperwork I had been working on had vanished. My desk was as clear as if it had just been set up. A quick search of the room yielded no clues. It was as if the shadow had consumed it all, along with a chunk of my skepticism. Since that night, I've taken precautions. I always keep a flashlight nearby, and I've even brought in some salt and sage, having heard those can ward off spirits. Some of my coworkers have noticed the new additions to my workspace and chuckle, thinking it's all a joke. But I know better. I've also done some research into the history of the warehouse. Turns out, it was built on old farmland, and there have been stories, tales I'd previously dismissed, of a shadowy figure that haunted the property, a figure whose appearance often portended strange disappearances and unsettling events. Had I been visited by this entity? I can't say for sure, but one thing is certain, I'm not staying late to find out. Every time I sit at that desk, I'm reminded of the incomprehensible event that turned my skepticism into a fearful respect for the unknown. I'll never forget the night the line between reality and the supernatural blurred, the night I met a shadow with the power to consume not just light, but the tangible world as well. And so, I continue to work, always glancing over at that corner, flashlight at the ready, as I try to convince myself that what I experienced was just a fluke, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know I'm lying to myself. And what's worse is the thought that lingers in the back of my mind.
I've been driving for Uber for years. It's not glamorous, but it gets the bills paid. Usually, the late-night rides are uneventful, drunk partygoers, exhausted night shift workers, the occasional airport run. But there was this one night, a night that felt off from the start. I got a ride request around 2 a.m. from a neighborhood that's usually quiet. It's mostly an industrial area, empty at this time of night. No real reason for someone to be out there. My gut was telling me to cancel the ride, but then I saw the surge pricing. I could really use the extra cash. As I approached the pickup point, I noticed a man standing alone by the side of the road. No luggage, no phone in hand, nothing. Just standing there, as if he'd been waiting for a long time. He got into the back seat and immediately said, "Drive. I'll tell you where to turn." Now, that's a red flag. Everyone knows you put your destination into the app. But then he added, Don't worry, I've got cash to make it worth your while. He held up a wad of bills. Foolishly, I started driving. After several turns into darker and more desolate roads, he finally said, "Stop the car." I had just pulled over when he leaned in between the front seats. "Ever think about how easy it would be for someone to hurt you?" he whispered. His voice was chillingly casual. Before I could react, he continued, "You're all alone out here. Vulnerable. No one would hear you scream." My heart was pounding in my chest. Every red flag, every warning bell was going off in my head. I was about to floor it when he chuckled. "You passed my test," he said, leaning back into his seat. "Your test?" I asked, trembling. "Relax," he said. "It's just a social experiment. You can drop me off here. And here's your money." True to his word, he left a pile of bills on the front seat and got out of the car. I didn't waste any time. I drove off as fast as I could. When I was sure I was safe, I counted the money. It was more than generous. But then I thought about it. A social experiment? Who does something like that in the dead of night? And why did he choose me? When I got home, I checked my car's dashcam footage. He had been holding something behind his back during our whole conversation. It was metallic and glinted ominously in the low light. Was it a knife? That's when I realized, whether it was an experiment or something far darker, it was a test I couldn't afford to fail. And it's one ride I'll never forget, a lesson that has forever changed my late-night drives.
I've been a registered nurse for about 10 years now, working in hospitals, clinics, you name it. But during the pandemic, house calls became more of a thing, especially for elderly patients who couldn't, or shouldn't, venture outside. Most of my house calls are routine, medication adjustments, wound dressings, and the like. But there was one night, one house, that I can't shake from my mind. It was already a busy evening when I received a last-minute call for a house visit. The patient was an elderly gentleman, Mr. Whitman, experiencing severe pain due to complications from a recent surgery. The request had an urgency to it, so I grabbed my medical bag and headed out. The address led me to an old, isolated house at the outskirts of the town. When I arrived, the atmosphere was off. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling off the walls, and there were no lights on inside. Something inside me screamed, "Turn around." But then I thought of the old man in pain and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting just behind it. A woman in her 40s, gaunt and tired-looking, greeted me. "You must be the nurse." "Come in," she said, her voice as cold as the night air. I stepped inside and was hit by the pungent smell of mildew and something metallic. The interior was as unkempt as the exterior, furniture covered in dust, cobwebs in the corners. "Mr. Whitman is in the room down the hall," the woman said, pointing to a darkened doorway. I walked down the narrow corridor, my own footsteps unnerving me. When I reached the room and turned on the light, I froze. The bed was empty. No signs of Mr. Whitman. No signs of any patient. Confused, I turned to exit the room, and that's when I saw it. Lined along the hallway walls were photographs. They were pictures of me. From the past week, month, and even some from years ago. Some taken from a distance, some uncomfortably close. My heart pounding, I rushed back to the living room. The woman was gone. Panic set in, and I bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Locked from the outside. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around and saw the woman again, only now she was holding a syringe, its needle glinting ominously. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered. The adrenaline kicked in, and I threw my medical bag at her, momentarily disorienting her. I seized the moment, sprinted to the window, and smashed it open with a chair. I climbed through, cutting myself in the process, but I didn't care. I ran to my car, unlocked it, and sped away like a bat out of hell. I reported everything to the police. When they arrived at the house, it was empty, no trace of the woman and the chilling photographs. Even more disturbing, they couldn't find any records of a Mr. Whitman needing home care. I don't do house calls anymore. And even now, I double-check my locks every night, haunted by the face of the woman and her chilling words. I've been waiting for you.